Mr. Speaker, I want to take a moment this morning to examine the biggest fraud scandal in the history of California and probably in the history of the United States. And that was the fraud in unemployment benefits that occurred in California during the COVID years, amounting to a minimum of $32 billion. $32 billion. Now, it's easy to kind of throw these numbers around and lose sight of what they really mean. So just to put that in perspective, that was half of the education budget in California at the time. It's more than the entire state budget of the vast majority of states in the country. Now, the reason that this scandal bears scrutiny right now is threefold. First, a state audit just found 2 weeks ago that this unemployment fraud in California is ongoing to this day, continuing to cost taxpayers billions of dollars. Second, the Senate still has not passed a bill that we passed in the House to hold some of these fraudsters accountable by extending the statute of limitations. And third, the Newsom administration, perhaps sensing the political peril following the events in Minnesota, has come out and absurdly tried to deny responsibility for this scheme, for this scandal, and even more absurdly tried to blame the federal government for it. So I want to go through exactly what happened, because I believe it is important to show why taxpayers were so thoroughly defrauded and to assure that this does not continue to happen going forward. The reality is that the fraud that occurred in California took place despite the repeated warnings of the federal government. And it was uncovered not by state officials, but rather by local prosecutors. On November 23rd of 2020, county prosecutors, a group of 9 of them, disclosed what they called the most serious fraud, significant fraud of taxpayer funds in California history. Now, at the time, they said they could only prove $1 billion. So $1 billion was already the biggest fraud of taxpayer dollars in California history. Now we know that it was at the very least $32 billion. Contrary to what the Newsom administration is trying to say now, at the time, the district attorney of Sacramento County, Anne Marie Schubert, said, quote, "We have asked and implored the governor to turn the spigot off." She said the governor's unemployment development office was not doing common sense things like checking claims with prison rolls, something that the vast majority of other states were doing and that the federal government had advised. She said this made the scheme, quote, "relatively easy." She called the governor's response slow and non-existent. She advised Governor Newsom to, quote, "look to other states for solutions." The district attorney of Fresno County, Lisa Smitkamp, said that Newsom, quote, "did nothing until the elected district attorneys brought it to the media," adding that she did not think the state has a handle on it. Those were comments made back in November of 2020. The following January, the state auditor came out with a report that laid forward in very precise detail exactly how significant the failures of the Newsom administration were, specifically with their unemployment office known as the EDD. A heading in that audit said, quote, "significant weaknesses in EDD's approach to fraud prevention have led to billions of dollars in improper benefit payment." Among the key findings, despite repeated warnings, EDD did not bolster its fraud detection efforts until months into the pandemic, and it suspended a critical safeguard. The audit goes on to list examples of where suspicious addresses were simply ignored and the claims process. In one case, more than 1,700 claims came from a single address. From one address, 1,700 claims. And yet, the checks were issued. One of the problems, as mentioned, was there was no cross-match system to cross-match the claims against the prison rolls. So you actually had checks that were being sent to state penitentiaries, to state prisons. Here's a timeline of the aforementioned warnings that actually came from the federal government. Now, this is significant again because the Newsom administration is now claiming somehow that it was California that warned the federal government, when in fact it was exactly the opposite, and other states followed these warnings. California didn't. In April of 2020, the United States Department of Labor sent instructions for implementing the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program and told states to take reasonable steps to deter and detect fraud, including audits. The following month, in May of 2020, there was a second notice from the U.S. Department of Labor, a warning to states to maintain the integrity of the unemployment program. Later that month, in May, the U.S. Department of Labor requested data from California, and the Office of the Inspector General warned California that the state was likely to see at least $1 billion in fraud based on new claims from March and April. During this time, the Newsom administration's EDD office had exactly two staff members who were responsible for reviewing suspicious claims. Newsom's EDD also allowed the backdating of claims until September of that year. So if you were a fraudster, you could simply claim that you had worked a certain number of weeks, previous weeks that had already passed, and there was no verification needed at all. The problem of suspicious addresses got even worse. The audit reports there were 26,000 addresses listed as suspicious, with more than 500,000 associated claims. The audit concludes our review illustrates that EDD continues to pay claims despite having evidence that they are very likely fraudulent. Again, this is a finding, this is a talking point not from the governor's political adversaries, not from people on social media. This is a report from the nonpartisan California state auditor in January of 2021 saying that our review illustrates that EDD continues to pay claims despite having evidence that they are very likely fraudulent. The audit continues that between March of 2020 and early January of 2021, more than 2.2 million claimants did not satisfactorily answer requests that they provide identity verification. In fact, there was another problem that then emerged from this, that people became victims of identity theft. And then they ran into issues like they had to pay taxes on wages they hadn't actually received. As mentioned, the audit also notes that EDD was unprepared to detect and handle the hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent claims associated with incarcerated individuals. I mean, how crazy is that? That you had claims coming in from state prisons, and those claims went out hundreds of millions of dollars. As the auditor says, as we described throughout this report, EDD's approach to fraud prevention and detection demonstrates the weaknesses caused by its, quote, poor planning and program management. Local media reports at the time substantiated all of these claims, including in publications like the Sacramento Bee and the Los Angeles Times. What's even worse is that the criminals who were purloining our state treasury of these taxpayer funds, in many cases, were using those dollars. I mean, what do you think they're using them for? We talk about waste as in this money is just squandered, but it's actually much worse than that, because the criminals who get these funds, they're not then giving them to charity, they're using them for further criminal activity. One example from the Sacramento Bee is about how these funds were used to buy guns illegally. For example, a report from the Bee reported that multiple fraudulent EDD cards were discovered along with firearms in the hands of convicted felons. Results that law enforcement officials say leads them to one conclusion: criminals are using funds from the growing EDD fraud scandal to buy weapons. Mind you, this was at a time when violent crime rates were soaring in California and far outpaced the rest of the country. Just to give you a couple examples, the Torrance police found that more than 24 people had been arrested in the fall of 2020 for alleged unemployment benefits fraud and identity theft. The 27 suspects used stolen identities to obtain over 130 EDD cards and when they recovered these, the authorities also found $150,000 and 4 handguns, including 2 without serial numbers. The Glendale police, in early 2021, arrested a man who was in possession of a so-called ghost gun, along with drugs and several fraudulent EDD cards, along with ammunition and various drugs and other illicit items. So, to summarize, you had the largest fraud of taxpayer dollars likely in the history of the United States. The nonpartisan state auditor in California, along with nonpartisan prosecutors from throughout California, clearly identified the negligence of the Newsom administration as enabling this fraud to occur, which far outpaced anything that occurred anywhere else in the country. You then had the criminal syndicates and other criminals, more run-of-the-mill criminals, who obtained these funds, use them to spawn further criminal activity that victimized even more Californians. And now, 5 years later, the fraud continues. The administration still hasn't learned its lesson. The same state auditor just found that EDD remains one of 8 high-risk agencies in California, a number that has doubled during the Newsom administration, finding that the EDD continues to allow billions in fraud, alongside billions that are being lost in fraud in connection with SNAP benefits, with improper Medi-Cal determinations, not to mention community college fraud, and fraud basically everywhere you look throughout the California government. And so now you have the governor insisting that none of this was his fault. California did nothing wrong. He's even made up bogus numbers like he somehow prevented $125 billion in fraud. So the concern is this: if the governor and his administration are unwilling to admit any responsibility whatsoever, despite the clearly established evidence of their responsibility, how can we expect this problem to ever be fixed? I will tell you, I am working in a bipartisan way here in Congress to bring accountability for the vast fraud that continues to take place in California, so that our tax dollars do not have to see their hard-earned money going to criminals and can finally start getting a reasonable return on their investment in our state government.
Today we are examining what many are calling the largest fraud scandal in California's history, and potentially the largest taxpayer fraud ever uncovered in the United States. This scandal centers on unemployment benefits fraud during the COVID years, totaling at least $32 billion in lost taxpayer funds. To put that staggering number into perspective, $32 billion was roughly half of California's entire education budget at the time, and more than the entire annual budget of most U.S. states. This issue demands renewed scrutiny for 3 critical reasons. First, a recent state audit found that unemployment fraud in California is still ongoing today, continuing to cost taxpayers billions of dollars. Second, the U.S. Senate has yet to pass legislation already approved by the House that would extend the statute of limitations and allow prosecutors to hold fraudsters accountable. And third, the Newsom administration is now attempting to deny responsibility, and has gone so far as to blame the federal government for failures that multiple audits and prosecutors say occurred at the state level. The reality is this fraud happened despite repeated warnings from the federal government, and it was uncovered not by state officials, but by local prosecutors. On November 23, 2020, 9 county district attorneys revealed what they called the most serious misuse of taxpayer funds in California history. At the time, they had confirmed $1 billion in fraud, already a record-breaking amount. We now know the true figure was at least $32 billion. Sacramento County District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert stated publicly that prosecutors had asked and implored the governor to turn the spigot off. She criticized the state's Employment Development Department, or EDD, for failing to conduct basic fraud checks, including cross-referencing claims with prison records, something most other states were already doing. Schubert described the state's response as slow and non-existent, and urged Governor Newsom to look to other states for solutions. Fresno County District Attorney Lisa Smitkamp echoed those concerns, saying the governor did nothing until elected district attorneys brought the issue to the media, adding that she did not believe the state had control over the situation. In January 2021, California's nonpartisan state auditor released a detailed report confirming systemic failures within the EDD. The audit found significant weaknesses in EDD's approach to fraud prevention that led to billions of dollars in improper payments. Despite repeated federal warnings, the EDD delayed strengthening fraud detection for months and even suspended critical safeguards. One example revealed more than 1,700 claims coming from a single address, yet payments were still issued. Even more alarming, the state failed to cross-check claims against prison records, resulting in hundreds of millions of dollars sent directly to state prisons. Federal warnings ignored. Federal agencies repeatedly warned California. In April 2020, the U.S. Department of Labor instructed states to take steps to detect fraud. In May 2020, another warning followed, cautioning states to protect the integrity of unemployment programs. That same month, federal investigators warned California it could lose at least $1 billion to fraud. Yet at the time, only 2 employees were assigned to review suspicious claims statewide. California also allowed claims to be backdated with no verification, making fraud even easier. By early 2021, auditors identified 26,000 suspicious addresses linked to over 500,000 claims, concluding that EDD continued paying benefits despite clear evidence of fraud. Even worse, investigators found that stolen unemployment funds were used to fuel additional criminal activity. According to reports from the Sacramento Bee, fraudulent EDD debit cards were recovered alongside illegal firearms, including ghost guns, in the possession of convicted felons. Police departments across California reported arrests involving stolen identities, hundreds of fraudulent EDD cards, large sums of cash, drugs, and unregistered weapons, all during a period when violent crime was surging statewide. This was the largest taxpayer fraud scandal in California, and likely U.S. history. Nonpartisan auditors and prosecutors clearly documented negligence by the Newsom administration that allowed the fraud to explode far beyond what occurred in any other state. Criminal syndicates used stolen funds to commit further crimes, harming even more Californians. And today, 5 years later, the fraud continues, with the EDD still labeled a high-risk agency by state auditors. Yet Governor Newsom continues to deny responsibility, even claiming without evidence that his administration prevented $125 billion in fraud. The concern now is simple. If state leaders refuse to acknowledge responsibility despite overwhelming evidence, how can this problem ever be fixed? Lawmakers say they are working across party lines to bring accountability, so taxpayer dollars stop funding criminals and finally deliver real value to the people of California.